The ballroom of the Vanderbilt estate glittered beneath 1,000 crystal chandeliers, but Eleanor Ashford felt invisible among the swirling masses of silk gowns and tailored tuxedos. She stood near the marble columns, her champagne glass held limply at her side, watching couples waltz across the polished floor with practiced grace. 3 years ago, she would have been in the center of it all, the celebrated heiress, the darling of Fifth Avenue. Now, at 26, she was merely a ghost haunting the periphery of the world that had once adored her. The whispers had begun subtly enough. First came the scandal surrounding her late father's financial mismanagement, accusations of fraud, though never proven. Then came the revelation that would seal her fate. The Ashford fortune was not inherited wealth, but built on questionable dealings. Within months, the doors that had opened so readily for her snapped shut. Invitations ceased. Old friends crossed the street to avoid her. Her own mother had made it clear, through a carefully worded letter, that Eleanor's presence at the family estate would only invite further scrutiny. Eleanor took a sip of champagne that had long gone flat, her pale blue eyes observing the grand tragedy of social destruction with the detachment of someone who had accepted her exile. She wore a gown of pale silver that had cost her nearly the last of her savings, a desperate attempt to blend into the world that had rejected her. The irony was not lost on her. Here she stood, dressed like a duchess, treated like a pauper. Miss Ashford. A voice cut through her reverie, belonging to Mrs. Catherine Worthington, an aging socialite whose opinion had once mattered enormously. "I must say I'm surprised to see you here, given circumstances." Eleanor turned with a practiced smile, the same smile she had worn 1,000 times before everything fell apart. "Mrs. Worthington, how lovely to see you again." The older woman's eyes flickered with something between pity and disdain, a look Eleanor had come to know well. "Yes, well, I suppose we all must maintain our traditions, mustn't we? Even when—" She trailed off, unwilling to voice what everyone knew. "Your mother sends her regards, I assume." "How kind of you to mention it," Eleanor replied smoothly, though the words felt like ash on her tongue. Her mother sent no such regards. Her mother, the Countess of Beaumont through her remarriage to an English nobleman, had spent the better part of 2 years ensuring that Eleanor's name never appeared in polite conversation. Before Eleanor could endure another moment of performative civility, a commotion near the entrance drew every eye in the ballroom. A man had arrived, tall, commanding, with the kind of presence that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He was dressed impeccably in a tailored black coat, his dark hair swept back from a face that bore the sculptural beauty of aristocratic heritage. But it was his eyes that arrested Eleanor's attention, cold, calculating, and bearing the weight of unspeakable burdens. Mrs. Worthington gasped softly. "Good heavens! Is that the Duke of Blackthorn? I heard he was in America, but I didn't believe—" Eleanor's attention sharpened. She had read about Alexander Whitmore, the 7th Duke of Blackthorn, in the society pages of the New York Times. British nobility, exceptionally wealthy, and carrying a reputation that was decidedly mixed. There had been a scandal in England 5 years prior, something involving his fiancée and a betrayal of trust. The details had been vague, but the implication had been clear. He had failed to protect those he loved, and that failure had marked him irrevocably. He was, in other words, a kindred spirit in destruction, though of a far more elevated caliber. The Duke moved through the ballroom with measured steps, acknowledging greetings with the bare minimum of courtesy. His gaze swept across the assembled crowds with the detachment of someone observing insects beneath glass. Then, inexplicably, his eyes found Eleanor's. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered across his severe features. Recognition, perhaps, or the acknowledgement of another person existing in similar exile. Before Eleanor could look away, Mrs. Worthington pressed a hand to her arm. "My dear, you must allow me to introduce you. Despite his reputation, the Duke is still quite an eligible match. A marriage could do wonders for your situation." Eleanor felt a wave of something between amusement and despair wash over her. "Mrs. Worthington, I'm not certain marriage—" But the older woman was already moving, pulling Eleanor along with surprising strength for someone of her age. Eleanor found herself being drawn directly into the Duke's path, her heart thundering against her ribs. She had not expected to meet him tonight, had not prepared herself for the intensity of his presence up close. "Your Grace," Mrs. Worthington said, her voice dripping with theatrical delight. "What an unexpected honor! May I present Miss Eleanor Ashford? Her family is quite well established, and she is, I assure you, a woman of excellent breeding and—" "Thank you," the Duke interrupted, his accent precisely clipped British English. His eyes moved to Eleanor, and she felt the weight of that gaze as if it were a physical thing. "Miss Ashford and I shall manage our own introduction, I think." Mrs. Worthington blinked, surprised and clearly delighted by this turn of events. She withdrew with a satisfied smile, leaving Eleanor alone with a man whose reputation suggested he could destroy her as completely as society already had. "Your Grace," Eleanor offered, because there was nothing else to do but acknowledge the strangeness of the moment. "You looked as though you were attending a funeral rather than a ball," he said, without preamble or social niceties. His voice was low, meant only for her ears. "A recent bereavement, or has your interest in life simply expired?" Eleanor's first instinct was to retreat into the carefully constructed politeness that had served her so well for so long. Instead, something in his directness, his refusal to pretend, unlocked a part of her that had been sealed away. "Both," she replied quietly, "though the bereavement predates my physical death by approximately 3 years. A flicker of something crossed his features. Was it amusement? "A woman who speaks the truth. How refreshingly uncommon. I am Alexander Whitmore. I suspect you know that already." "I do. The scandal sheets are quite thorough." "As are they regarding you, Miss Ashford. The ruined heiress, abandoned by family and friend alike, cast out into the wilderness of genteel poverty, while your former acquaintances pretend never to have known you." He paused. "Rather biblical in its execution, don't you think?" Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest. This man, this stranger with the haunted eyes and the reputation for broken trust, was looking at her not with pity or disdain, but with recognition. He saw her exile not as shame, but as truth. "The wilderness is rather crowded, I've found," she said. "One tends to pass other exiles without acknowledging them. By mutual agreement, I suspect. And yet here we are, acknowledging each other." He extended his hand. "Shall we scandalize Mrs. Worthington by dancing? I confess, I find propriety tiresome when it's employed as a weapon." Eleanor took his hand, and as they moved toward the dance floor, she felt something she had not experienced in 3 years, the faintest glimmer of possibility. Not hope, exactly. Hope seemed too fragile a thing to harbor, but possibility, like the first hint of dawn on a long night. As they danced, neither of them noticed Mrs. Worthington watching from the sidelines, her eyes alight with the satisfaction of a social architect convinced she had orchestrated something momentous. She had, though not in the way she imagined. The morning after the Vanderbilt ball found Eleanor in the modest boarding house on the Upper West Side that she called home, a far cry from the mansions of Fifth Avenue. She occupied a small third-floor room that caught the afternoon light and cost her nearly half of her meager monthly allowance, a pittance from a trust that could not be touched by her family's creditors. She was mending a tear in one of her stockings when a messenger arrived with an invitation. The envelope bore the seal of the Whitmore residence, a rental property in Manhattan that the Duke had acquired for his stay in America. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she opened it. The invitation was sparse, direct, and utterly unconventional. A private luncheon at the Duke's residence the following day, with a simple note written in masculine script. "I find myself in need of interesting conversation. You strike me as a woman who might oblige. A.W." Eleanor stared at the invitation for a long time, her rational mind cataloguing all the reasons she should decline. A single woman accepting an invitation to a man's private residence would be social suicide, even for someone who had already been destroyed socially. It would confirm every whisper, every suspicion, every veiled accusation that had followed her since her fall. And yet, she had spent 3 years adhering to every rule, following every convention that remained available to her. She had been cautious, reserved, invisible. It had changed nothing. She was still exiled, still abandoned, still waiting for life to resume while standing perpetually on its margins. She sent her acceptance by return messenger. The Duke's residence was a palatial townhouse in the most exclusive neighborhood Manhattan had to offer, a place Eleanor had walked past 100 times during her years of exile, always conscious that such spaces were no longer accessible to her. The servant who answered the door regarded her with the dispassionate professionalism of someone accustomed to aristocratic eccentricity. He led her through corridors, lined with art that likely cost more than her entire building, to a private dining room that overlooked Central Park. The Duke was there, dressed in a waistcoat of charcoal silk, his dark hair catching the afternoon light. He rose as she entered, his expression unreadable. "Miss Ashford, you came." "Did you doubt I would?" Eleanor asked, settling into the chair he held for her. "I doubted it for approximately 20 minutes after sending the invitation," he admitted. "Then I decided doubt was a luxury neither of us can afford." The luncheon itself was unusually informal. They ate fresh oysters and cold chicken, dishes that required minimal formality. But it was the conversation that struck Eleanor most forcefully. Alexander did not ask her the polite questions designed to maintain social fiction. He asked her about her father's financial dealings, not with judgment, but with genuine curiosity about the mechanics of the collapse. He asked her about her mother, and when Eleanor described the letter of estrangement, he nodded with the understanding of someone who knew abandonment personally. "My fiancée," he said, as they moved from the dining room to the library, "was engaged to me for precisely 43 days before she chose to run away with a man who could offer her passion instead of duty. I loved her, or so I believed. But what I actually loved was the idea of her, a woman who would solidify my position, my legacy, my understanding of myself as a man capable of building a future." Eleanor, curled into a wingback chair with a cup of tea, listened intently. No one in society ever spoke of such things with such raw honesty. When she left, I believed it was because I had failed her, failed to inspire in her the kind of transcendent love one reads about in novels. For 5 years I carried that failure like a stone in my chest. He paused, his gaze fixed on the park beyond the windows. "Then I came to America and saw you, and I realized something rather profound. Failure, when shared across enough souls, begins to resemble something else entirely." "What?" Eleanor asked. "Truth," he said simply. "The world would have us believe that we fail individually, that our destruction is unique to our inadequacies. But you and I, Miss Ashford, we were not destroyed because we were uniquely flawed. We were destroyed because we made the mistake of believing in the world's capacity to show loyalty. And the world, I'm afraid, has no such capacity." Eleanor felt something crystallize within her, a permission, almost, to stop blaming herself for the failure of others to maintain their love for her. "What would you have me do?" she asked quietly. "Why have you brought me here?" Alexander rose and moved to a portrait hanging on the library wall. It was a painting of a woman in emerald green, her expression caught between melancholy and defiance. "That is Catherine," he said, "my sister. She married a man beneath our station, a man our family deemed unsuitable. When his business failed, she found herself in circumstances not dissimilar to your own, though with the added complication of 4 children and a husband who disappeared to the continent to avoid his creditors." He turned back to Eleanor. She is currently living in a small house on Long Island, raising those children on a governess's salary, and what financial support I can provide without drawing unwanted attention from our family's trustees." Eleanor felt the weight of what he was not quite saying. "You're telling me this because I am acquainted with the particular agony of watching someone you care for suffer the consequences of society's arbitrary cruelty. And because I have recently come to understand that I'm no longer willing to simply bear witness to such suffering." He moved back to where she sat, and Eleanor found that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Ashford. It is unconventional, it will raise eyebrows, and it will place both of us in significant social jeopardy." Eleanor's heart had begun to race. "What is the proposition?" "Marry me," he said simply. "Not for love. We are both too pragmatic for such an illusion, but for survival. A marriage to a man of my standing and wealth would restore your position, or at the very least provide you with the financial independence to choose your own path. And I—" He paused, and for the first time, Eleanor saw something vulnerable cross his features. "I would have the opportunity to build a marriage that actually means something. One not constructed on the foundation of fantasy, but on the honest recognition that we are both exiles seeking refuge." Eleanor sat in silence, her mind fracturing into 1,000 pieces. "You would do this?" she asked, "when you know nothing of me?" "I know enough. I know that you do not lie. I know that you have endured abandonment with dignity rather than desperation. I know that when given the opportunity to retreat into comfortable lies, you chose truth instead." He extended his hand. "I know that you are precisely the sort of woman with whom one could build something real." Eleanor reached out and placed her hand in his, and in that moment, something shifted in the architecture of her existence. She was no longer waiting for her life to resume. She was seizing it. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the private chapel of the Whitmore residence, attended by only the most essential witnesses required by law and propriety. Eleanor wore a gown of cream silk that Alexander had commissioned from the finest dressmaker in Manhattan, a woman who had once created gowns for Eleanor's mother. The irony was not lost on her. She was being remade through the financial grace of a man she had known for mere weeks, rather than through the birthright she had been denied. The marriage certificate was signed, the vows were spoken with formal precision, and Eleanor Ashford became Eleanor Whitmore, Duchess of Blackthorn. When Alexander kissed her at the conclusion of the ceremony, it was not passionate but rather purposeful, a seal on a transaction, though one that felt somehow less mercenary than many actual love matches Eleanor had witnessed among the aristocracy. "Well," Alexander said as they rode through the streets of Manhattan in his private carriage toward the townhouse that would be their home, "we have done it. Let the scandal commence." And commence it did. The news of the wedding spread through society like wildfire. A disgraced heiress marrying a British duke was precisely the sort of narrative that society both condemned and consumed with ravenous fascination. Eleanor received calling cards from women who had abandoned her 3 years prior, their expressions shifting from disdain to carefully calculated interest. Invitations to dinner parties and balls began to accumulate. But Eleanor found that none of it touched her, because she was no longer performing for an audience. She was living in a transaction she had consciously entered into, and that made all the difference. The early weeks of her marriage were nothing like the romantic novels she had read in her youth. She and Alexander maintained separate bedrooms, communicated mostly through cordial discussion over meals, and moved through the social calendar as a united front while maintaining an essential emotional distance. It was, Eleanor reflected, the most honest marriage she could have imagined. Then came the night that changed everything. Alexander had been attending a gathering of businessmen downtown, men involved in financing a new railroad expansion. He returned home near midnight, and Eleanor, who was preparing for bed, heard the unmistakable sound of him ascending the stairs. But something was different. His movements were erratic, not the measured steps she had come to expect. She emerged from her room to find him leaning against the wall of the corridor, his face flushed, his breathing ragged. "Alexander!" She hurried toward him. "What has happened?" "There was an altercation," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "One of the businessmen, a man named Carlyle, made reference to you, to your father's business dealings, suggesting that you had somehow been complicit in the fraud, suggesting that our marriage was merely my attempt to acquire ill-gotten gains." Eleanor felt her stomach clench. Even now, 3 years into her exile, she could feel the power of such accusations to wound. "I struck him," Alexander continued, and now Eleanor saw the torn edge of his jacket, the slight redness around his knuckles. "I struck him, and I would strike him again. I do not care that we have married for pragmatic reasons. I do not care that our arrangement lacks the sentimentality of conventional unions. You are my wife, and your honor is not a matter for negotiation or speculation." Eleanor found that she was crying, the first time she had allowed herself tears since the initial catastrophe of her fall. "Why did you do that?" she whispered. "Because," Alexander said, moving toward her with surprising gentleness, "I have spent 5 years carrying my failure to protect Catherine from society's judgment, and I will not make the same error twice." He reached out and took her face in his hands, and the gesture was so filled with intention that Eleanor forgot to breathe. "I began this marriage," he said, "intending to construct an alliance of mutual benefit, but I find that my intentions have become considerably more complicated." Alexander," she began, but he silenced her with a kiss, not the perfunctory seal of their wedding, but something deeper, something that tasted of redemption. The weeks that followed were a careful navigation of new emotional terrain. Alexander did not declare grand declarations of love. He did not transform into the hero of a romantic novel. But he did begin moving his possessions to share her room. He did begin to position himself between Eleanor and the subtle cruelties of society. And most significantly, he began to listen, not as a husband listening to his wife, but as another person genuinely hearing the burden of another's existence. In turn, Eleanor began to lower her carefully constructed walls. She told him about the night her mother had written the letter of estrangement, about how she had read it 100 times, searching for some indication that it could be forgiven. She spoke of her fears that she would never be anything but the daughter of a disgraced man, no matter what name she carried or what wealth she possessed. And Alexander, rather than offering platitudes, simply said, "Then we will redefine what your name means. We will make Eleanor Whitmore a woman of such unassailable dignity that your family's rejection becomes irrelevant." "How?" Eleanor asked. "By living," he said simply, "by refusing to hide, by supporting causes that matter, by being visible in our convictions, by making it clear that we are not ashamed of who we are or where we have come from." It was a revolutionary idea, and Eleanor found herself drawn into the possibility of it. 6 months after their wedding, Eleanor stood in the entrance hall of a new foundation that bore her name, the Ashford Whitmore Institute for Women's Financial Independence. It was housed in a converted mansion in Washington Square, and its purpose was radical for its time, to provide education and training to women of all social classes, ensuring that they would never find themselves economically dependent on the capricious loyalties of family or society. The idea had emerged from a conversation Eleanor and Alexander had shared late one evening as she recounted the particular terror of realizing that her survival was entirely dependent on the sufferance of others. Alexander had listened, and then he had done what he always did. He had moved from listening to action. The funding had come primarily from his personal wealth, supplemented by donations from a carefully selected group of wealthy women who had recognized in Eleanor's vision something that resonated with their own frustrations. The society pages had been merciless in their critique. A woman, a disgraced woman no less, establishing an institute to educate other women in financial matters was seen as dangerous, radical, and inherently threatening to the established order. Eleanor found that she did not care. She stood now in the Institute's main hall, watching the first class of students arrive. There were women of every description, the daughters of merchants, the widows of failed businessmen, even a few young women of good family who had quietly slipped away from their homes to attend. "You did this," Alexander said, appearing beside her. He carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who had made peace with scandal. "I provided the funds, but you built this." "We built this," Eleanor corrected. "All of it, the money, the vision, the willingness to stand against social judgment. None of it would exist without both of us." Alexander took her hand, and Eleanor noted that this gesture, so simple, so seemingly unremarkable, would have been impossible 6 months prior. He had not touched her in tenderness then. He had maintained the careful distance of a man entering a transaction. That man no longer existed. "I had a letter from Catherine," Alexander said. "She wishes to volunteer her time helping women navigate the dissolution of their husbands' estates. She has indicated that she would be quite happy to move to New York permanently if the arrangement were acceptable." Eleanor felt her heart contract with something that took her a moment to identify as joy. She had never met Alexander's sister, though he had spoken of her often. The thought of having another woman in their circle, someone who understood the particular alienation of social exile, felt like a gift. "I would like that very much," Eleanor said, "and I suspect she and I could accomplish considerable work together." That evening, as Eleanor dressed for a dinner party that would introduce their institute to the city's more progressive socialites, she caught her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the ghost who had haunted the Vanderbilt ball less than a year prior. This woman carried herself with visible purpose. This woman had transformed her abandonment into something constructive, something meaningful. She was no longer waiting for the world to validate her existence. She was creating her own reality. Alexander appeared in the doorway, already dressed in his evening clothes. He watched her for a moment before speaking. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Marrying a man you did not love? Entering into an arrangement that was fundamentally mercenary?" Eleanor turned to face him fully. "I have discovered," she said carefully, "that love is perhaps not what I thought it to be. I believed love was meant to be passionate, transcendent, transformative in the way that novels describe. But I have come to think that love is perhaps something quieter, something constructed through trust and partnership and the mutual recognition that we are both broken in ways that fit together.